afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Elaine. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on key success factors of building private LTE networks for critical industries. My name is Isaac Mia. I'm the VP of Sales and Support Engineering at Redline Communications, a North American manufacturer of industrial-grade wireless solutions. So today, we're going to talk about building private LTE networks and some key success factors to ensure that anyone, any of us embarking on this journey achieve the objectives that we set forth in the beginning of such an undertaking. We will talk about why this is the perfect time for critical industries to look at private LTE, the options available to deploy the technology, specifically from a spectrum perspective, and then the overall architecture, very high level. We won't have that much time to get into the nitty-gritty of the architecture. We'll try to keep it at high level. And then last but not least, the key success factors to ensure successful deployment. The first question that I think we need to answer is, why LTE? And LTE, it's all about enabling the digital transformation that the critical industries are now going through. We know that we are embarking on a journey to transform our industry. Some call it the fourth industrial revolution. And to embark on that digital transformation, the very first foundational project that typically we need to start looking at is building a connectivity platform. And when it comes to that platform for critical industries, which in a lot of cases go beyond, geographically, go beyond just the regions that are typically serviced by telcos, private LTE at times become essential, and hence those investments need to be made. And so if we look at digital transformation in critical industries, overall, what is digital transformation? Big data, artificial intelligence, or machine learning, and then connectivity. Now, these are, the buzzwords that are not that new to this industry from our perspective. Data collection of the infrastructure in place. Data acquisition via SCADA networks has been happening. When it comes to basic machine-to-machine communication, communication between protection relays, for example, in a substation environment, that is machine-to-machine communication, and the protection schemes are deployed via those algorithms. Overall, we already know that none of this is possible without connectivity. But where LTE comes into play is when this connectivity has to go beyond fixed assets. Because now when we look at whether it's public safety or video surveillance or mining or utility industries, the situational awareness in real time is becoming a necessity, and technology now is available that will support and provide that kind of situational awareness in real time, and hence these applications come into play. The business case for private LTE, depending on your situation, in most cases is pretty much proven. The advantages of private LTE deploying such a network is pretty clear. And it is essential that in order to transform the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure digitally, a connectivity platform needs to be built. And LTE becomes a key component of that connectivity platform, which can go beyond LTE, but in most cases, LTE will be a necessary ingredient of that underlying foundation. Now, one thing that we would like to highlight, though, although the technology is not new, we know that carriers have been deploying it for years now. Overall, mobility has been available as an application to us for decades. But we do have to keep in mind that when it comes to digital transformation projects, and building private LTE networks is a component of it, these projects have historically faced a significantly higher rate of failure. A lot of it is to do with the nature of the industry. But if you came across a study that was published in Forbes in 2019, or if you've looked at the chaos reports recently, these kind of projects suffer from a significantly high failure rate, which when it comes to critical industries, such a high failure rate cannot be it's simply unacceptable. So hence, we need to look at how can we improve the success rate for such projects. But before we do that, let's dig a bit deeper into what private LTE is and why it's necessary. And then at this point, I'll hand it over to Dwayne Zimmer to take it forward.
Thanks, Isak.
What are you doing? Yep.
So, private LTE, why do we need private LTE as a solution? Now, when we look at what our successful metrics are for projects, we need to meet requirements. Obviously, we need to deliver on schedule, we need to deliver in budget, and give some expected value to the overall network. Now, interestingly enough, ubiquitous wireless, we're getting more and more deployments, solutions out there that are giving more broadband to end users. This, I think, is blurring a lot of the project guidelines. And I think a lot of people are now getting a little bit more confused as to the requirements, first off. But we're also getting to be able to be very creative with the deliverables. And I'll dig into this more when we discuss NB-IoT. Now, when we're selecting a product or a vendor, resiliency, not only in the product itself, but in the technology, the solution that we pick, we need to have longevity. We can't, the big question that I think a lot of people ask with a lot of proprietary networks, even older networks, is what's the longevity of the technology? Can this technology last for a given amount of time for the project? Are there going to be reliable stocks of the product deliverable or to be delivered to the client? And then two, what kind of services can the vendor themselves provide? Vendors should be able to, and especially in an RF world, provide the RF planning, the network design, and in a lot of cases, obviously, they need to be able to support their product. So the solution itself also needs to be, especially in our industrial markets and in our industrial networks, it has to be simple enough that the local IT staff can first off understand what they're troubleshooting and hopefully get to the point where they can even expand on these networks. So getting into the simplicity of just deploying and understanding the technology.
Excuse me, Dwayne?
Yes.
Sorry, I think your slides are not moving. Can you make sure? Are you on the right slide?
Are you saying private LTE?
Yes.
Yeah, don't worry, I'm getting there.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I thought, okay, apologize.
No worries. So really, private LTE provides so many benefits right now, and it's now a very well-defined, very mature, especially in the 4G solution, technology that can be delivered and cost-effectively delivered to end users. So LTE as a whole, 4G LTE provides great robustness. We've got capacity. So if we're deploying our own private industrial LTE network, we have control over the capacity. We can add more sectors, we can design to increase the download, we can choose channel selection, we can add carrier aggregation to increase bandwidth. If we are in control of all the entire network, the private network, we have control over the capacity and bandwidth. And there's no data caps from carriers. Coverage, I mean, we can tailor the coverage to what our needs are. And in a lot of situations, where a good portion of our clients are anyways, especially when it comes to mining and offshore, they're out of the coverage area of the carrier, or alternatively, there may only be one cell that covers these areas. If we deploy our own private networks, we have full coverage and control of these networks. So when we're talking about control, we're talking about prioritizing traffic, setting what's called QCI values to prioritize, let's say we're looking at sensor SCADA data, for example. If we're putting that over an IP network, we can prioritize voice, we can prioritize control systems, and we can do that very securely. LTE is very secure in the fact that we have SIM cards and we do over-the-air encryption. And then, of course, it's IP-based, so we can enhance the IP security within our own network based on tried and tested IP security firewalls and network policies. And of course, if we, again, private network, we control how low our latency is. Again, with the QCI values we can set, we can also give a priority on that latency. And of course, the wonderful thing about LTE is the mobility aspect of it. Mobility is baked in, and it can replace a lot of other solutions. The LMR solutions, for example, we can even add IP phones into the mix to enhance the mobility aspect of it. And then finally, the interoperability. 4G, we have a wide selection of vendors when it comes to not only the mobile devices, but the radios that sit on the tower, the core, which we'll get into later. We have great flexibility there. And then on the mobile front of it, we're creating a mobile network that's not competing with a tier 1 carrier service, but providing the same services as a tier 1 carrier. And now with eSIMs and dual SIMs coming into play, we can limit the number of devices that end users need to carry with one phone. So we can put a SIM that belongs to your private network and then another one that belongs to the public network. So they can roam between the two networks, making sure that when they're in the coverage area of the industrial network, they're using that for their selected network. So, we talk about private networks, but I mean, there's a sizable public network out there, numerous of them, especially in the United States, Europe, Canada, all over the world. 4G LTE is everywhere. And in the US right now, it covers 98% of the population. So the majority of the country is well covered. It's easily accessible. And for small networks, it's cost effective. And again, 3GPP LTE or 4G LTE is secure. But when we're talking about these private networks, what happens when we need to scale out, when we need to increase our bandwidth requirements, when we need to add more devices, security, preemption, QoS, things of these natures that are not supported in the public LTE networks that we need control over. That's when we look at these private LTE networks. So obviously, like we said, they're very secure. We're not routing any of our traffic through a public network. We can keep even mobile calls within the confines of our field area network. We can set it up so that we have predictable performance. And again, we were talking about, or I had mentioned, QCIs. We can set predictable performance. So if we have, if we're monitoring certain systems and we need certain latency, we need to make sure that they go through our network properly, we can set up predictable performance. We don't have this SIM lock-in issue. So, when we'll talk about NB-IoT devices or IoT devices, we're required to set up a SIM card for each device, and that will lock it to a public carrier, for example. When we hold a private network, we can control that. We are the carrier, so there's no need to go out and change out our SIM cards if we need to change carriers. And when we're looking at things like smart grids and solutions like that, where we're adding monitoring via a cellular network, what happens if you as an industry need to change carriers. Maybe it's more cost effective. Now we're either reprogramming eSIMs on every device or we're truck rolling. Now this reduces OpEx costs just in itself. If you're viewing it as what would happen if I need to change carriers? What do we need to do? Greatly reducing OpEx costs. And the OpEx costs, reducing the OpEx costs, I should say, we also have other things that reduce it, such as, like I said before, we're not paying for bandwidth. We're not limiting our minutes on our cell phones. We have access to, cellular towers at our disposal now. We're not going in and trying to or need to purchase more devices. So, or sorry, I should say we can purchase devices and we can install them on our network. And this is huge, especially when we're talking about scalability now. IoT is coming into play once we start scaling more and more devices. So for example, even if a public LTE network has a reasonable deployment for these IoT devices, we now have to take into account of the time to register these devices. And then two, the cost of these devices, obviously. If we control our own private network, we can scale these as we see fit. So industrial LTE and industrial IoT, I should say, is, again, I think one of those buzzwords is just now coming to fruition. IoT, the Internet of Things, I mean, we've been hearing it for the last couple of years. How does that fit into the mix? IoT growth, 34% of cellular communications by 2025 will be IoT. That's accounting for 3 billion cellular devices installed on networks. Now, there's other solutions out there. There's low-powered wireless networks that are cost-effective, long-range, and scale. We've got things like Sigfox, LoRa, Weightless, but they require all new infrastructure. So again, we're looking at monitoring and managing a whole nother solution. And there's poor downlink. They may be unsuitable to receive updates and require truck rolls to apply security updates, for example, or replace devices. LTE in release 13 is releasing the CAD-M and the NB-IoT. Now, these are going to allow great scaling options, and especially if you're controlling your own private network, we can add as many of them pretty much as we want. So we can dig in a bit. So if we talk about the narrowband solutions, the narrowband solutions are going to piggyback on existing 4G. The device itself, so sorry, let me just, pardon me. So we separated, so in the release 13 solution, we've been separated into two user devices, the NB-IoT and the CAD-M devices. And each one of these serve a specific function. For example, the NB-IoT device is a 200 kilohertz channel that is just low throughput. It's great for sensors, as you can see, smart metering, pipeline management, street light monitoring, things of that nature. And the great thing about these devices, very low power requirements. So you can plop them in and you're not worrying about truck rolls and for battery replacements, as they can last up to 10 years. And then vendors have also been claiming up to 25 miles of connectivity. And then considering that these devices are slated to cost dollars to bring them into the network, they're going to be incredibly attractive for all utilities, and they'll be creatively implemented into mines. And then for the higher bandwidth applications, we have the CAD-M, and the CAD-M will provide 1 megabit per second throughput. In comparison to the NB-IoT, that's going to give 200 kilohertz. The CAD-M will be able to support things like surveillance, more high bandwidth solutions, and it's still going to have low power requirements. So these are going to fit in really good in other verticals, like for drones or vehicle communications. And like I said, still providing voice calls and mobility. So the key takeaway from the private LTE portion of it and the key factors of it all is we have to gauge our network. We have to gauge what our requirements are going to be and how do we make these networks successful. So for one, we can integrate aging networks. We can replace our mobile land radio networks, the P25 and Tetra networks. We can pull these in under the LTE network. We can also remove a lot of these proprietary wireless solutions and expensive cable infrastructures. And again, this reduces administration and management costs. And they're also incredibly quick to deploy when we're doing comparisons with expensive cable infrastructure. When we have to pull in fiber, we can stopgap a lot of installations with a LTE UE, for example. And the last real big point that we have to bring up again is growing need for security. Security costs. You know, they said the average data leak in the United States right now is $3 million cost to the company. That's average. So there's growing need of security. So when we're talking about key factors, we're talking about reducing overall operating costs. Not only that, though, we are talking about protecting our infrastructure securely. So the elephant in the room is spectrum. Spectrum is cost prohibitive. You know, we have numerous options out there. You know, we talk about licensed, shared, and unlicensed spectrum. Obviously, our licensed spectrum is sought after by carriers. It's dedicated, it's high cost for the most part, but provides mission critical. And then two, when we're looking at it in comparison to shared and unlicensed spectrum, we actually have way more bands to choose from in licensed spectrum. Now with the shared spectrum, this is maybe a little bit of a newer discussion, but it's shared amongst subscribers. It's going to be lower cost than licensed spectrum. And we have models already in existence. For example, CBRS, which I will use as a model in this presentation, is being adopted or being looked at being adopted worldwide as giving a cost-effective spectrum for end users for 4G and 5G networks, private networks. And then in the EU, the LSA is being currently under review, which is somewhat being driven by CBRS. And then finally, unlicensed spectrum. I mean, everybody probably uses unlicensed spectrum. It's shared amongst everybody. It's fairly agnostic for the most part. It maybe even be a bit considered the wild, wild west at sometimes out there with some of the solutions, but globally very accepted ISM bands. So one of the key things that we need to look at when we want to design a successful LTE network is our geographic location, especially when we're looking at licensed spectrum or leased licensed spectrum. MSPs lease or MNOs will lease spectrum in areas where there's no advantage to them to deploying it and cost effectively doing it, making them regionally available. And they're private network ready. As I said, there's many 3G bands available, or sorry, 4G bands available that can be selected from and can be deployed under the guise of industrial LTE. You just have to reach out to MNO in the area and request and see if they have any spectrum. And there's other options for requesting spectrum too, but we won't get into that here. There's also public safety networks. FirstNet in the United States, unfortunately, is not available, but there's other places in the world where public safety networks are given the ability for end users to deploy these private LTE networks cost effectively with the they still have to be able to provide some sort of private or public safety network priority over their traffic. However, if you're looking at some of the places below here, you know, mines, ports, or grids, there may not be the population required to worry about too much traffic being transmitted over these networks. And this is making it very advantageous for people to start looking at these public safety networks, as it's beneficial not only to the organization who wants or the government that wants the public safety network, but obviously to the industry that wants to deploy the private network. So when we talk about managed spectrum, this is going to manage spectrum and manage shared spectrum, such as CBRS, are cost effectively opening up private LTE, and in a lot of cases have been conceived of to support 4G and 5G networks. And again, your shared spectrum, and it's very cost effective. The CBRS solution in the United States, they designed it around a 3-tier solution, as you can see here. So incumbents, the whole goal was to protect incumbents like Navy radar from the 2 other tiers, and the priority access, or the PALs, are currently being auctioned in the United States. I was going to check today on what the auction is. You can find that online on how many bids have gone through and what the dollar value is. It's fairly big bucks, but the PAL auction is not hindering the GAA. So the generally authorized access is you pay a subscription fee and you can pop up an eNode B and create your own private LTE network, again, very cost effectively. So there's other countries that are planning on using this model. For example, Canada, where I live, ISED has been looking into the successes of CBRS for some time and to see how it's going to pan out. Hopefully, once some of the dust settles on the PAL auctions, we'll have more definitive answers. But other countries like Holland and Germany, the UK, are all looking at deploying their own managed shared spectrum solution. And in the EU, the licensed shared access, or the LSA, with band 40, a well-developed LTE band, has been gaining traction. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. And of course, unlicensed spectrum. I think many people have already been burned by, especially in highly populated areas. Interference obviously is not one of the successful, or adds to the success of a private network. It's a hindrance. It makes it so that we have issues with mission critical networks. We cannot rely on, in a lot of places, on the unlicensed spectrum to provide dedicated bandwidth to our end nodes. But that doesn't mean we can't rely on it. Like Wi-Fi and LTE are going to complement one another. And in fact, Wi-Fi just released a new standard with Wi-Fi 6, which is going to take advantage of the 6 gigahertz band. And I've got 24 gigahertz here for 5G. This is going to be for the massive broadband, and in some cases will likely not be applicable to a lot of industries, as it's not going to be very long range. But however, in high bandwidth requirements in the future, there may be a driving factor to light up these 24 gigahertz channels to increase bandwidth. So again, Wi-Fi is not going anywhere, and we're going to use it to complement coverage of LTE. So we're going to use these unlicensed spectrum, these Wi-Fi nodes, again, to cover smaller areas. I don't believe we can rely on unlicensed spectrum in a lot of areas, just due to that interference factor, but we can still use it in small areas. For example, where our LTE sector isn't going to cover, or the carrier won't cover, it may not be cost effective to throw in an eNode B. And LTE in itself is moving into that LLA or LTU in release 13, so LTE unlicensed. Now this would be detrimental, obviously, considering what I just said about 900 and 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz being slammed with interference. But the United States just released 6 gigahertz, 1 gig of available spectrum, or 1.2 gig of available spectrum. And it's important to note that the United States has driven a lot of spectrum decisions globally. So we can see as this very massive spectrum space is open up, how that's going to change LTU. And again, that's going to really drive the selection on the devices that users put into their networks. But we talk about spectrum. Not all spectrum, we don't need to sit on one channel. We don't need to select one channel in a lot of instances. especially where we have numerous options like the shared spectrum, unlicensed, and maybe even we do get a hold of a licensed carrier. We tailor our coverage, we tailor our spectrum needs with our frequencies, so our coverage needs. So for this example, you know, if we needed to cover a small area with a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi access point, you know, we can. We're not expecting it to go far, for example, or we need to mitigate interference that's a cellular network's providing. We can deploy these 2.4 networks to enhance local areas. But let's say you need to stretch out further. So we blanket an area with the 2.4 to cover a smaller footprint, giving higher bandwidth. But we can overlay that with a mid-band spectrum, like in this example here, this is a CBRS band covering a larger area. Now this is great because it obviously extends our network, and 2.4 and 3.6 physically are fairly similar. However, we don't have the power options in the 2.4 gigahertz to transmit as far. So by opening up and using these mid-bands to complement the Wi-Fi, we can extend our coverage ranges. And extending our coverage range obviously gives us more connectivity, gives us a better footprint, allows us to connect more NB-IoT devices, reduce the overall number of eNodeBs, or replace a Wi-Fi mesh network as one of those aging technologies. And then if we're looking at something like a leased spectrum, this one is 900, actually the Anterix band coverage in the United States. We can see here that the physics of the lower band spectrum even goes further. Now the CBRS band and this low band have the exact same transmit power. But as we can see, the longer bandwidth or longer wavelength transmits much farther. This gives us way more coverage area. And these are going to be good for NB-IoT solutions and mission critical mobility, especially if we can get a hold of these leased spectrums. So we've put this all together. When we're looking at spectrum in itself, it's a key factor of success, obviously, to pick the correct spectrum or pick the correct spectrums. Again, the wonderful thing about LTE is we can select numerous devices that may support several bands. Now, if we're lucky enough, we can align all these bands together and pick products that support these bands, and that's usually, they fit with the country that you're in. So this is giving us a substantially large coverage area. So again, the larger the coverage area, the less of the investment. So depending on gauging your technological solutions, gauging your coverage area, that's going to dictate your spectrum and what transmit power you're going to need, for example. So Redline has been part of the digital transformation for 20 years. We have P2P and point-to-multipoint solutions, and we have our own LTE solutions. So the P2P, PMP, and LTE solutions are all high-quality, industrial-grade products. So because we're looking at LTE as a key success factor in building mission-critical networks, we have to define or we have to provide a very highly reliable radio. Now, the RDL 6000 is a great radio, great example of an industrial hardened solution. As you can see, operating temperatures of -55 to +60. We work in corrosive environments, and we have stainless steel fasteners, so again, no corrosion. It's light, and it is built on 3GPP standards. So another nice thing about the RDL 6000 of the products, especially when we're looking in building out these networks, is a lot of solutions have split architecture, a radio head and a baseband unit, and these require high throughput CPRI connections between the two of them. These radios, and another key success factor that we have to look at, is being able to install and deploy these radios in field without a lot of individuals having to rely on complex solutions. So this is where, again, selecting a vendor, selecting a solution that's simple to install, lightweight, and built for the environment. All LTE solutions require a core. Now, this isn't meant to complicate the solutions. It's meant to enhance it. It provides the mobility throughout the network. Redline's EPC core is very affordable. It can fit on a virtual machine. It's very cost effective and modular. We can scale out the components, and it scales down. We don't want to have to be on the hook to purchase thousands of licenses when we only need, hundreds. And this is not to give the Redline sales pitch too much, but as industrial networks, you're not going to need the tens of thousands of users in the core. You're not going to need the $500,000 or $1 million core solution. You're going to need scaled down small networks to support mobility and IoT. Whereas carrier grades, they don't scale down, they only scale up, and they may require a great amount of infrastructure. The core itself, so for example, the Redline core can be scaled down so far as to be put onto an Intel NUC. And you can see it's a very small unit. And it can support up to 50 users, I should say. And it's ideal for small operations. We can put this into cell on wheel deployments, and we can create many purpose-built LTE networks under one organization if so desired. Or they can be integrated together. And then because LTE is IP-based, we can again treat all of the components as modular, and we can add additional IP services into the mix. And then end user devices, obviously it's going to be another key success. We have to pick the devices that fit the need of the network. Phones, for example, are going to start replacing radios. They're going to start replacing handheld LMR radios with over-the-top solutions like push-to-talk. And again, like I mentioned before, dual SIM functionality is going to allow these devices not only to exist on the private LTE network, but within the MNOs, the carrier networks. So this is limiting the need for users to carry multiple devices, which is great because you now have less devices to administer from an administrative standpoint. And you can have these devices dedicated on your network. Additionally, mobile routers. We can mobilize vehicles, we can mobilize heavy trucks, we can mobilize anything now with these mobile routers. So the mobile router can be fitted with a Wi-Fi hotspot as well to increase the coverage area around and give access to several users from a vehicle. And this also can feed telemetry data and maintenance information back from the vehicle, decreasing maintenance costs. And then finally, fixed wireless access points. These solutions can be installed quickly within your LTE network or private industrial LTE network to provide backhaul to remote offices, to vehicles, to hotspots. Like if you have to set up a mobile hotspot somewhere from a vehicle to service an area temporary, you can set this up. And all these devices have the ability to enable, so the mobile user, let's say vehicles and remote trailers with high bandwidth. And that's the key, high bandwidth. So I went into the Redline portfolio quite a bit. When it boils right down to what we're looking at coverage for critical industry and how do we make these successful? So obviously we need to talk about reliability. You need a network that's reliable, that's going to support the IoT solutions that's going to support the AI and machine to machine. So things that can withstand harsh environments. We've also got, IP68 and ATEX requirements now. So IP68 devices that can be submerged underwater. So mines, for example, underground mines, or ATEX for explosion proof. And corrosion proof. There's a lot of corrosion environments out there, from oil and gas fields to offshore rigs, again, and to mining. But, and obviously, budgeting, we have to make these devices cost optimized. When we're looking at carrier grade equipment, for example, the capacity and the coverage is great. But again, these are designed for highly scalable mobile networks that really aren't going to be designed for these harsh environments, and won't be cost effectively to deploy, especially when you're looking at the core solution that needs to be, tens of thousands of users. So we need to be looking at these metrics when we're selecting vendors. Latency, as we discussed before, we need to start looking at latency. It's no longer bandwidth being the contributing factor to networks, it's latency. AI and mobile workers, for example, people who drive mining machinery from control rooms, this latency has to be decreased to not only increase safety, but to increase productivity as well. So from us looking at the equipment side of things, we need to start selecting the equipment for the environment. That means selecting the vendor, selecting something that's cost effective, and something that we can make reliable. So selecting a future-proof technology, I don't think there's any better example, and we haven't seen any in the past 20 years when it comes to 3GPP LTE. So we started off with a 3G solution that evolved into 4G. These were backwards compatible, meaning that mobile phones and other solutions could coexist on the same network. Now we're moving towards 5G, and I mean 5G, I think for a lot have been a buzzword, but 5G moving forward will be, by the way, there'll be a graceful transition into the 5G world. But again, when we talked about the reliability and resiliency, is a lot of the MNOs will focus on peak data rates, spectral efficiency, and things of that nature that aren't going to allow us to align with the industrial network space, because in the industrial network space, we're going to have to emphasize the importances of latency and connection density. So I'll explain this really quickly. The connection density, as we are growing our sensor network out with IoT, so the NB-IoT and CAT-M solutions, we have to be able to reliably scale that out. And then when we're looking at the current state of AI machine to machine, we have to be able to decrease that latency so that we have that reliable connection for obviously enhancing the performance, but again, safety. And these are all mission critical, especially our latency portion is going to more and more be reliant, or give us that reliability we need for mission critical. So when we look through, we have a couple of success stories here here at Redline that we have distributed or set up and had clients deploy industrial private LTE networks. So we've deployed an offshore solution that required private LTE between vessels and between several platforms. There was lots of backhaul disconnect issues just due to the ocean being the ocean, and they wanted the personnel on not only on the rigs but on the ships to be able to communicate with one another and have bandwidth. So to provide a reliable solution, we deployed each rig with a full complement of EPCs. So the EPCs, when we're talking on a mission critical network, we've set up a redundant network of EPCs. So if one EPC goes down, you're not losing connectivity. This is great because we can set up so backhaul services go to the second EPC on a different network node that have different backhaul requirements, and they maintain that connectivity. This was a master-slave relationship between the two. So the HSS was synced over to both EPCs. And this created a very highly reliable network just on EPCs. Case study 2 was an Arctic port mine that we had deployed. Now this required us to cover a lot of space, 100 kilometers, where there was unreliable power and underperforming networks. Now, the wonderful thing about LTE as well is we can overlay our sectors and do handovers, like with mobility in carrier grade networks. And again, providing a high level of reliability across the entire network. And this was one of many requirements in this project, but we also needed a reliable solution that could operate in -40 Fahrenheit. So for this solution, Redline deployed a complete private LTE network with backhauls, and we used our over-the-top FlexTalk push-to-talk network to replace their LMR solution, reducing their administrative costs. And of course, we had to deliver this with a low power solution. And our last case, we have deployed in an open pit mine. Now, again, a lot of the requirements that we've seen in the prior cases, except now we had additional issues. ATEX came into play for blasting. So this was deployed. We had to cover 12 miles of conveyor and provide VoIP services, so over-the-top solutions, voice solutions to keep people connected, where LMR solutions potentially may have not provided the requirements, the mobile broadband. And again, just due to the coverage area, Wi-Fi wouldn't cover the area. A mesh was not a viable solution. So a private LTE network came into play. So setting up 2 AE-NO-Bs to cover the mine, we provided a blanket coverage with redundancy for numerous different types of devices, iPads, mobile phones, and even did some underground tests. So when we talk about these private networks, there's huge success factors that were built into these. Obviously, we reduced administration costs, was key one. We expanded mobile broadband solutions. And again, security, maybe not key in these areas, but or in these sites, but was added in intrinsically. So when we come to the creating a critical network, we have to think of key factors for the success of the network. So we have to have it, make sure that it's reliable and available. Cell overlap, great example. One cell goes down, another one comes up. EPC reliability, we've got 2 places for traffic to ingress and egress, and mobile cellular devices moving over as part of the standard. And we need, for reliability, rugged industrial grade equipment that protects your investment. So what does downtime cost companies? By incorporating an industrial network, LTE network, that takes advantage of cell reuse to overlap these sectors, it's going to help out immensely just keeping these networks operational and covered, even if we lose a sector. We have to talk about, cost effectiveness. Obviously, and I worked for IT for many years, you always wanted the big budget, but I think a lot of IT people didn't understand that you need a return on your investment. So keeping these costs down, or making sure that the costs align with the value added at the end of the day. And then mitigating the risk. We have to talk about we have to think about how these networks are going to aid in not only preventing the risk of the network, but how it's going to help mitigate a lot of the other risk in the network. As we grow as industries now, we have to be cognizant of things like security and safety. These are risks. We have to be able to scale, and we have to deploy solutions that are viable for long periods of time. And the nice thing about the private LTE networks is that cellular solutions are everywhere. They're well established, and we can select from what we would like to put into our network and what we would like to see. So really, in closing, when we're looking at key successful factors of networks, we talked about private LTE versus public LTE and the benefits there. We're talking about how your network's going to scale, your coverage area, what kind of bandwidth requirements in growing, NB-IoT, how do these all affect you? And what's going to be your requirement? And your requirement, if you measure that against the need and what's deliverable from your public MNO, you may see a great value of deploying a private LTE network versus going on a public network. We talked about spectrum options, unlicensed, licensed, and shared spectrum. We have numerous options available to us and opening up to us right now. This is going to enable a great deal of mobility, bandwidth, and really just deployments of private LTE like we've never seen before. We now have more and more spectrum options. I talked a little bit about the industrial solutions that Redline produces. And again, this isn't necessarily to wave the Redline flag, but to show that there are industrial solutions out there. We can select hardware that fits our industrial need. So, and simply fit our industrial need. The other thing is that these solutions need to be simple. You're not going to have, or a lot of organizations that want to deploy these networks, I think, feel handcuffed because of the learning curve. They feel like they need to have a resident PhD LTE person on site to take care of the network or deploy the network. This is no longer the case. 4G LTE is well established, and it's been simplified by a lot of vendors, including ourselves. And we did some test cases. We talked about the EPC and reliability within that core network. Again, we can deploy numerous cores now. In the old days, if you had a network that needed redundant connection, you set up hot spare routing. This would have a switchover. There would be a downtime in the switchover. We can set up LTE so that there's a quick handover between cores, so we're not dropping calls and we're not losing connectivity. And because we have numerous cores at numerous locations, we can set that up so we have that redundant backhaul out to the internet and out to the world. And one thing I like talking about again too, and another key success, is that this is all IP traffic. So we can integrate all of our services into an LTE network, all using IP networking and IP best practices, which you're reducing the learning curve, you're reducing a lot of inputs and learning new technologies. So thank you guys very much for your time today. Isak, did you have anything to add?
Thank you, Dwayne. You covered everything. The only thing to add would be questions. If there are any, please shoot right now. We still have 5 minutes. Or you guys can also reach out to us directly later on, or even better, reach out to your local Winncom representative or Redline representative with any questions you might have. Remember, private LTE or 4G as a technology has been around for a while, so it may be new to your organization, but that does not mean that help is not available. So do not hesitate to reach out. And you know, we're ready for your questions right now or anytime afterwards.